Hello everyone and welcome to our next Global Contemporary Unit video. This is video 2. We have 5 works to cover today. And today we're going to focus on looking ahead. The same points apply to this unit. We talked about these last time, some essential points, remembering that art is very global. We're looking around the world. Artists are challenging things from the past. So feel free to review those or pause the video to take a look. Once again, the same question applies. How do contemporary artists relate to the past, present, and future for today's audiences? And as I mentioned, we're starting with looking ahead today. So first things first, we're going to be looking at 2 works of architecture in this unit. The first one is the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, and that's in Spain. If you have not been to a Guggenheim Museum yet, they are around the world and they are known for their intense and beautiful architecture. They often challenge what we previously thought of as museum architects or architecture. And so the architect of this one is Frank Gehry. He has done many incredible works around the world, and this was done in 1997, mostly in titanium, glass, and limestone. There is a steel skeleton within it, and you can see some of that here in the glass areas. So when you look at the form overall, just to begin with, as far as buildings go, compared to what we've seen in the past, you might notice some big changes. First of all, we see lots of different curves, convex, concave forms. We see lots of different materials. The titanium is a new material, so we see lots of light reflecting. And we see lots of decoration and ornamentation that's very different from what we've seen before. So let's move on and talk about it a little bit more. This is also an interior spot of around the lobby, just so you know. You can see the walls are very curved. Even the window areas are curved. So we also have these 2 pictures off to the side here. Here's another interior space. You can see there are lots of curved, angled walls inside. And then here's a picture at night, just so you can see what the titanium does as the sun's setting, as the time of day changes. It really plays with whatever the light does to it. So this form, the way that Frank Gehry made a lot of his works, he was trained as a sculptor, but he would make models, like paper models, and then he'd start to cut and reattach them into different positions. So think about like making paper cubes and then cutting them up, reattaching them as a way to kind of problem solve and think about new design. This is something very different than architects of the past have done because they might have been more limited by the design elements, the technologies, and the materials that they were using. They'd have certain things that they'd have to do. Walls have to be straight. You need specific steel beams that go in this direction. But now he is able to be much more playful with his design just because of how many advancements there have been at this time. So I mentioned there's a steel skeleton and titanium is the outside. Metal is a lot cheaper, so it's an easy material to use. And then we have a lot of the glass that lets natural light in. This is a known museum that's difficult for display just because of all of the curves on the wall. However, it's worth it as far as design goes because it does challenge the norm of museums. So even though it's not the most ideal for a large rectangular piece, it's all about moving forward and innovating with designs at this time. So as far as content, we're kind of talking about style deconstructivism. If you think about the 5-year plan deconstructivist piece that we looked at that was more collage, you could see multiple elements kind of put together. It almost looked cut up and re-put together, and that's kind of the same way that he works. He's working on disrupting what we think of conventional museums, what we think of conventional buildings. And so you see lots of imbalance, asymmetry, and then there are also some, it kind of resembles a fish or a ship, especially on the side that is right next to the river. And just to skip down to context a little bit, Bilbao originally was a shipping and fishing port. It's on the northern coast of Spain, and so just a really small community at first. And so he wanted to reference that in his design by giving it these curvy shapes and kind of make you think subtly about a ship or a fish. And while we're on context, the influence on Bilbao was immense. This museum was built in 1997. And what has happened since then, the first 3 years, 4 million visitors came, and now it is one of the most visited cities in Bilbao. It changed hotels, restaurants. It's now actually like a kind of an elite place to travel in Spain. They have some of the best restaurants in the world. So something like this, a museum, can really shift and impact a community in a really incredible way. So then finally, it's just a museum for contemporary art. It is a Guggenheim Museum, which makes it a little more special just because they're known around the world for their museums. So let's move on. We're going to talk about this quote for just a second. Thing that Frank Gehry said, if you have to go backward, why not go back 3 million years before man to fish? And that's where I started with this fish stick. As I think of it and started drawing the damn things, and I realized that they were architectural, conveying motion even when they were not moving. I don't like to portray it to other people as a complicated intellectual endeavor. Most architects avoid double curves, as I did, because we didn't have a language for translation into a building that was viable and economical. I think the study of fish allows me to create kind of a personal language. And so you can see in some of his other buildings too, this kind of curvy fish influence. But he's trying to bring it down so that anyone can appreciate the piece, not just the highest architects. And here's a picture of him. This is him in his 90s, and here's actually a home that he built too. All right, let's move on. Our second work of architecture, in some ways it is similar. This one was done about a decade later in 2009. This is the Maxi National Museum of 21st Century Art, and it's in Rome, Italy, in the northern region. It's by an architect named Zaha Hadid, who died a few years ago, but she is so well known for her architectural works around the world. She's Iraqi-born, but lived in Britain. And this was made with glass, steel, and cement concrete. All right, let's move on. So a little bit about her. Here she is in one of the interiors of her buildings. This is another really well-known building of hers. You could see very, very innovative in the way that she's using curves with architecture. So I'll just read a little bit of this to you. I see the Maxi as an immersive urban environment for the exchange of ideas, feeding the cultural vitality of the city. The Maxi should not be considered just one building, but several. The idea was to move away from the idea of the museum as an object and toward the idea of a field of buildings. After many studies, our research evolved into the concept of the confluence of lines, where the primary force of the site is the walls that constantly intersect and separate to create both indoor and outdoor spaces. It's no longer just a museum, but an urban cultural center where a dense texture of interior and exterior spaces have been intertwined and superimposed over one another. It's an intriguing mixture of galleries, irrigating a large urban field with linear display surfaces. So just a little bit more about it, and I'm going to go back just to show you so you can kind of see all of these linear elements that she's talking about. The staircases and also the lighting has this really smooth black finish, and then she'll have walls and different forms that have white finishes, and then we do see the concrete exposed. So similar to the Guggenheim Museum we just looked at, there's lots of curves in this space, but maybe differently. There's a little bit more a geometric play than there was with the more curvy concave convex forms that we saw with Gary's museum. All right, so there's a glass ceiling to this piece, and I'm going to just zoom in for a second so you can see this view of northern Rome. So this is the Tiber River, and we see the grid of kind of a normal city. The museum is right down in here. So there's all these gridded, organized buildings. A lot of them have a lot of history. Think Rome, think of the length of time people have been living in this space. And so she's incorporating the river as kind of an influence with these lines. And as you walk around in the area, you start to see parts of this museum pop out over historical buildings. So it's a way to kind of connect the past and the history together when you are walking around and kind of approaching the space. All right, so I said concrete, there's a lot of white and black, especially on the interior. There's a lot of fluidity with the design. So we see the interior and the exterior kind of playing with one another because of a lot of the glass walls. And this is a museum meant for 21st century art. So that doesn't necessarily mean paintings on the wall. That means installations, that means performance art, that means video There's so many different forms, and that's why this is more of a cultural center, because they really wanted to make it a space that could be used throughout the 21st century. We talked about the connection to the river. There's a Baroque influence too. If you remember San Carlo Quattro Alfontane, that church, there was a lot of convex and concave forms. Remember, it had that oval ceiling, and the walls would kind of undulate back and forth, making you connect the interior and the exterior together. So that kind of elaborate ornamentation is changed, but here you don't see a lot of that elaborate ornamentation, but instead you do see that kind of play with interior and exterior. That's also something with the international style. If you remember, we looked at Le Corbusier's house, and there's that play of interior, exterior, and also form following function. So the fact that this space is very open, it makes it functional for art of all types in this ongoing century. So she connects with the past and the future in this work. A lot of her work, she's trying to do that. She'll reference things from the past, but really looking towards the future. It's a very historic place, so she's using concrete to kind of remember or reference the ancient Romans' use and love of concrete as a material. But then she's elevating it and using it with other materials that are more modern. And so she's really starting this new future of architecture, or was. And that's about it for that one. Let's move on. So this is A Book from the Sky by Xu Bing. This was started in 1987, finished in 1991. Mixed media installation. You can see it's taking up an entire room here. We have scrolls of text hanging from the ceiling in this nice curved space. We also have all of these books that are laid out on the floor and opened. So when they open, they have these little curves as well. We're talking hundreds of them. And in total, there are 4 volumes. So at the beginning, we see these 4 separate volumes that all of these smaller books are supposed to be a part of. And there's also text on the wall as well, more of these scroll style ones as well. So let's learn a little bit more about this. So Xu Bing was raised in China and lived there for a long time. And he actually, I'm skipping right to context here, he grew up during Mao's Cultural Revolution. And so he actually was sent to the countryside and worked on making banners, propaganda pieces, things that would be seen in the lives of the Chinese people all the time to kind of influence them. And so there was a lot of propaganda that he was raised in with his artwork. He also, originally, this work was submitted and accepted by the government in China at an avant-garde show. So originally it was really highlighted by the government and accepted. Then later on, after things started to shift, this is following Tiananmen Square's massacre, the government started to believe that maybe he had some subversive text within his piece that they didn't understand, and maybe it was anti-government. So he ended up not being in the favor of the Chinese officials and leadership. So he eventually immigrated to America, where he was able to produce his art more freely. So let's talk about the piece. So I talked about the 4 volumes. It's hand-bound. The symbols are Chinese looking. When you look up close at them, let's see how close I can get. They do resemble Chinese characters. However, they are not real. They are actually meaningless. He made them up to look like Chinese characters, but they don't actually have a meaning. And so the way that he did this, took a lot of work, you can imagine, was he used this process called carved wood block. If you've ever done printing, you can use wood blocks and do this. And this is a very common way that early type was created. Probably with his work with Mao and the propaganda movement, they used this type of type. So it's mass-produced, easy to do, and he would make these and repurpose them and use them over and over again in different combinations to make his text. Book arts is a very traditional art in China and around the world as well. But so he used those. Also scroll painting is as well, and he used that to influence his piece. The overall piece roughly resembles a landscape. So we have these scroll pieces hanging from above that are backlit, so they're supposed to look like clouds. And then the pieces on the ground resemble these waves because they've got all of this undulation. So he's referencing Chinese scroll landscape painting in this kind of like really loose way. But then he's also referencing the mass media production of text. So as I just said right there. The function of this piece. So he wants you to think about text as propaganda and how that impacts people in their lives. And so we know propaganda can come in a lot of different ways, but text is a very common way to experience propaganda. So he's also working on combining modern with tradition. Western with Chinese viewers kind of view this piece very differently. So he's making an art installation, which is a very modern piece of art, but he's using these traditional book arts and wood carving blocks to create it. The reason the Western and the Chinese viewer kind of view this differently is when somebody who cannot read Chinese looks at this piece or maybe doesn't have the historical understanding of Chinese art forms, they would interpret it in a way where they maybe wouldn't feel as connected. They'd be a little confused because they don't know what is actually being said with these words, and they may not see the reference of the landscape or the book arts and the history. A Chinese viewer would also be confused, but in a different way, because as somebody who speaks and can read Chinese, they would look at these and feel both connected to it, but also confused because they wouldn't understand the text, even though it looks so similar to something they would understand. So he's playing with these, contradictions. There are a couple right there. Mass production of text is a low art form with printing, and then the landscape painting is a high art form, so kind of playing with those things together. All right, moving on, just a little more about him. He is an artist who has kind of dedicated his life to text. After his experiences as a young person in China, I think he's really connected with those. And so a couple other projects that he has worked on that he's known for are the Square Words project. This is where he would take basic symbols that we understand, for instance, the restroom symbols, and start to turn them into characters that also look and resemble Chinese, but in this case, they are written in English. So you see the M, the E, the N, men right here. We have women over here. They're purposely making you think and look a little bit deeper. This is the living word project of his as well. So he has text on the floor and it starts to float off into this space. So really interesting guy. All right, moving on to another person who's kind of looking ahead in her style. This is Emily Kame Kangware, and this is Earth Creation, created in 1994. She used paint on canvas, large piece, and this is where it is located. So just let's zoom in a little bit on this piece, just so you get a better visual of it. From afar, you may not appreciate as much of the detail, but when you get up close to it, you can see there's a richness in it, in the layering of the paint and the details. And there's different textures in different parts, overlapping of different shades and hues to kind of create this movement and rhythm with the piece. The other picture on this screen is a picture of her working. So most of her works, her paintings, she only really painted in this way for about 8 years, the last 8 years of her life. So she was very old, and she would put the canvases on the ground and work on top of them, moving around. So she is also very prolific. She did about 3,000 paintings in the last 8 years of her life. So really impressive, and most of them are large scale. All right, so a little more about her. This piece is 20 feet by 9 feet, very abstracted. You see lots of different colors. There are loose depictions of plants. We're not talking about like actually, oh, here's a flower, here's a leaf, but more so there's some, in the abstraction, you can kind of pull apart vegetal feelings. I know that's very vague. I talked about how she is on the ground working. Earlier work, she had more representational plants and animals, and then later she starts to abstract a lot more. And there are elements that make you think of the seasons just with the color she chose. There's a lot of movement and rhythm in the piece. So her earlier work, before the 8 years where she was a painter, she began with ceremonial sand and body painting. She lived in a clan for most of her life in Australia, where she didn't access the rest of the world. So the first 2/3 of her life, she lived just with this clan community, had never traveled outside, didn't connect with the rest of the world in any way. And so they would have ceremonies that are very traditional in Pacific cultures, with dancing and chanting, and she would do sand paintings, and she would also do body painting for these. She also spent a lot of time on batiking, which is a way that you can dye fabrics, and all of those things kind of influenced where she went with her art eventually. This shouldn't be here. This is actually from another piece. My apologies. So the function of the work, she was recreating some of the art to reference the place that she lived, and really Aboriginal styling is what she focused on in her work. So just kind of referencing her own culture in her pieces. And so speaking of that Aboriginal culture, a little bit of history. In the 1920s, the Europeans came and they took the Australian lands, and then 50 years later, in 1970, the Aboriginal people received their land rights and independence. And this style was born with Aboriginal artists, and she was actually one of the leaders and the elders creating this style that we know of Aboriginal art today, which has lots of dots, lots of lines, and high contrast between the two. So very abstract, but really engaging and kind of draws you into it. This style, specifically her style, but also Aboriginal art in general, really gained global appeal in the 20th century. And then this piece actually in 2007 was the first piece by a woman and the first piece, the first piece by an Australian woman and the first piece by an Aboriginal artist to be sold for over $1 million. So she, considering she only painted for the last 8 years of her life, really gained fame quickly and kind of made a name for herself and the art form from her culture. And just to show you a little more, here's a couple of her other pieces. Here's a photo of her. They are vast and lots of detail, very rich in color as well. All right, let's move on. We're going to look at the Electronic Superhighway by Namjoon Paik. This was from 1995. Mixed media, you can see there's lots of screens here, and we see lots of neon lights kind of separating different states. This is like a 40-foot long piece. You might notice different states have different things going on in their TV monitors, so we'll talk about that a little bit. And if you think about 1995, it was a very different time, pre-internet, and TV was really a way that connected people together. So Paik's vision for the future. He envisioned that in the future, communication would be boundaryless due to advanced technology. It would be pertinent to mention that what Paik envisioned has now manifested through the internet. So he didn't exactly know that what he was talking about was the internet, but that's really what it became. And it's very funny that he used the title Electronic Superhighway for this art piece, because that's often what people refer to as the internet now. So it's just kind of a funny aside. So there are TVs, there's also cameras. In New York State, there's actually a camera that looks out at you, so when you're viewing it, you are connected onto the screen. Also content, we've got the different states. He picked what was on the TVs based on his own references to film and TV. He's often considered the father of video art, really one of the first people to work in this new media. And his hope was that the new media would help to address social issues, everything from segregation and race to pollution to the modernization of our economy. And he also was raised at a time in America where the interstate was new. So the interstate was a way for people to travel and see different states, different parts of the country that they hadn't before. So that was something that really kind of drew him in to the piece. And even though it's about this digital connection, there's also the real connection of driving around, seeing neon lights on signs as you're stopping at motels. So there's kind of these two different things interplaying. And a little more, he was born in Korea, studied in Tokyo, and then he moved to America in the 60s. And that's when the interstate was really becoming a new concept, where Americans were traveling around, and TV was also a really new, innovative way to connect people together. Here's a picture of him. And just so you know, he has lots of pieces, is continuing to work. A lot of them have to do with surveillance, and they have to do with video And here's another quote. Pike predicted as collage techniques replaced oil paint, the cathode ray television tube will replace the canvas. Something he predicted, and he still uses that in his work today. All right, we have one more piece, The Crossing by Bill Viola. All right, this is a really cool piece. It's a video that originally was like 11 minutes long. There's a 2-minute link here to watch the video. I highly recommend it so that you get the chance to really experience the piece fully. This is from 1996, video and sound installation. And you see one still right here from it. I'm going to move on and show you this one. So the way that this works was you'd walk into a dark room, and then on both opposite sides, there would be these giant screens, kind of the size of a human, and you would watch these two videos play simultaneously. So on one side, we've got the man with fire, we've got the other side with the man with water. And the way it goes is the men slowly walk up, they stand in the front of the screen, stare out blankly, and then slowly the fire comes up from the feet and then overtakes the man. The water starts with a couple drips and then really overtakes the man. And then eventually they disappear. After being encompassed completely, nothing remains and it's over. And so they play it once. The film he used was extremely sensitive, more sensitive than the human eye. And then they slowed it down into slow motion so that you could experience every single detail of this horrific or really intense experience. So there's these two opposing forces that he's using, fire and water. We have our own references with those concepts, but then he also uses kind of the religious symbolism. He considered himself considers himself a Zen Buddhist, but he's referencing things like in Hinduism, Shiva with the ring of fire, Christianity, the rapture and flood. And then with Buddhism, it's meditation. And the way that meditation is connected is the whole piece is supposed to make you contemplate your own awareness. So by standing there and experiencing the piece and watching this happen, it's asking you to focus on one thing, drop all of the other narratives, all the other things, your grocery list, the homework you have to do, and instead just experience this one moment. It's also about kind of changing from human to non-human, physical to spiritual. So he's kind of taking you to this out-of-body experience through this piece. Just to show you a little bit of his others, Martyrs was actually one that they had at the Memorial Art Gallery. There's a small room, and on 4 different screens on each side of the room, these images were playing. It was a really intense piece because you can see there's a lot of intense emotion at the tied up nature, the fact that we have the sand and the gravel coming down, the fire once again. So lots of experiences that might come up as you're watching that piece. And here's just a quote by him. Here he is. "We have to reclaim time itself, wrenching it from the time is money, maximum efficiency, and make room for it to flow the other way, towards us. We must take time back into ourselves to let our consciousness breathe and our cluttered minds be still and silent. This is what art can do and what museums can be in today's world." So he's asking you to take a breath, take a moment, and experience in a really thoughtful and aware way, instead of the go, go, go with the time is money kind of idea. So a little bit about our artists that are looking forward. So we looked at Bill Viola. We looked at that video. Definitely check it out if you can. The electronic superhighway, a huge change in America. We looked at Earth's creation, kind of connecting back to Earth and cultural identity. We looked at Xu Bing's piece, which connects mass media and print, back with landscape painting, tradition, non-tradition. We looked at 2 works of architecture, the Maxi Museum, and then also Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Spain. So I hope you enjoyed and got some great information out of those pieces, and look forward to talking to you tomorrow.